Andrew Tate complains about his meal. But what the waitress responded left everyone speechless. In today's video, we're diving into an unexpected dining drama that had everyone talking. Andrew Tate, known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude, found himself less than impressed with his meal at a high-end restaurant. But what really stole the spotlight was the waitress's jaw-dropping response, leaving everyone in shock. Buckle up, because this story has all the twists and turns you didn't know you needed. Andrew Tate, the self-proclaimed king of hustle, swaggered into one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Known for its world-class chefs and decadent menu, the establishment promised an experience as refined as its clientele. The dining room sparkled under the glow of chandeliers, and the air carried a symphony of delicate, clinking glasses and soft murmurs of sophisticated conversation. Tate was no stranger to luxury, and this evening was meant to be no different. He settled into his reserved seat at a prime corner table, where the ambience was carefully curated for patrons like him, individuals accustomed to the finer things in life. The leather-bound menu presented an array of meticulously crafted dishes, each described with flourish, as though every item was a masterpiece. Tate barely glanced at it, opting instead for the restaurant's signature dish. A man of action, not deliberation, he trusted that the best of the best would meet his standards. Moments later, the waiter arrived with a flourish, presenting Tate's chosen entree with all the grandeur befitting its reputation. The plating was immaculate, a picture-perfect display that could have graced the cover of any culinary magazine. But as Tate lifted his fork, anticipation mounting with the promise of perfection, the first bite delivered something unexpected. His expression shifted subtly at first, a slight furrow of the brow, before a deeper frown settled across his face. "What is this?" he muttered, setting his fork down with a deliberate clang. He motioned for a passing waiter, his voice cutting through the refined air. "Excuse me, but this is not what I expected." The room grew quieter as nearby diners' ears perked up, sensing a brewing storm. Andrew Tate was known for his unapologetic candor, and when he had something to say, the world usually took note. When the waitress finally arrived, she seemed unaware of, or perhaps unimpressed by, the presence of a man whose opinions often made headlines. She approached the table with a poised stride, radiating calm amidst the palpable tension in the room. Her uniform was immaculate, her smile professional, and her clipboard held with the precision of someone who had handled many a demanding guest. "Good evening, sir," she greeted him warmly, though her tone carried an unmistakable undertone of self-assurance. "I understand there's a concern with your meal. Could you share what seems to be the issue?" Tate leaned back in his chair, fixing her with a piercing gaze. "The problem?" he began, his voice steady but edged with dissatisfaction, "is that this dish isn't living up to the standards I was expecting. The flavors are unbalanced, the texture is off, and frankly, it's not worth the reputation this place boasts." The waitress listened attentively, nodding slightly as he spoke, her expression giving no hint of defensiveness or anxiety. She let him finish without interruption, her composed demeanor seemingly amplifying the tension. The room was silent now, every pair of eyes discreetly, or not so discreetly, focused on their exchange. The soft hum of background music seemed almost too loud, as though the restaurant itself were holding its breath. "Thank you for your feedback," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. There was a brief pause, just enough to build anticipation, before she continued. "Allow me a moment to address this for you." Her words were carefully chosen, but something in her tone suggested she was not just another waitress catering to complaints. She was deliberate and confident, a stark contrast to the fiery dissatisfaction she faced from Tate. As she turned to leave, a faint smirk tugged at the corners of her lips, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. It was clear to everyone watching that she was not intimidated, not flustered, and certainly not about to let the situation get the better of her. Tate, ever the keen observer, seemed to notice too. For the first time that evening, a flicker of intrigue crossed his face. The room waited, breathless, for the next act in what was quickly becoming an unexpected showdown. As the waitress returned to the kitchen, the atmosphere in the dining room remained electric. Guests whispered to one another, exchanging theories on how this unusual scene might unfold. Some speculated she would apologize profusely and offer a complimentary dish to soothe the dissatisfaction of such a high-profile diner. Others expected her to call over a manager, perhaps to smooth things over diplomatically. But no one was prepared for what came next. Several minutes passed before she re-emerged, her steps measured and deliberate as she approached Tate's table. She carried herself with an air of quiet confidence, a sharp contrast to the tension radiating from her surroundings. Placing her hands lightly on the edge of the table, she looked directly at Tate, her expression serene yet unyielding. "Mr. Tate," she began, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure those nearby could overhear without it seeming intentional. "I appreciate your honesty. It's rare to encounter someone with such a keen palate and the courage to express their thoughts so openly." Her words were polite, even complimentary, but there was an undercurrent to her tone, something subtle yet undeniably pointed. Andrew Tate raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to her words than mere deference. "Glad to hear it," he replied, his voice low and measured, matching her tone. "I assume you've brought the chef out to explain why this dish doesn't meet basic expectations." The waitress smiled, the corners of her mouth tilting upward in a way that suggested she was entirely unshaken. "The chef sends his regards," she replied, her eyes unwavering. "However, I felt it was only fair to address your concerns personally. After all, I was the one who recommended this dish." The room seemed to lean in collectively, the tension mounting as her words landed. Andrew Tate's expression hardened slightly, his sharp mind already dissecting her approach. "And?" he prompted, gesturing for her to continue. "What's your explanation?" Taking a deep breath, the waitress straightened her posture, her voice clear and deliberate as she delivered her response. "Sir, while I respect your critique, it seems to me that the issue here isn't the dish itself, but rather the lens through which you've chosen to view it. This meal is crafted with precision and care, using ingredients sourced from the finest suppliers and prepared by chefs who have spent decades perfecting their craft. Perhaps the real question isn't whether the dish is flawed, but whether your expectations are." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, their impact reverberating through the room. A few diners gasped softly, while others stifled nervous chuckles, unsure whether to admire her audacity or cringe at her boldness. Tate's reaction was the one everyone awaited, and he didn't disappoint. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table as a slow, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Interesting," he said, his voice calm but edged with intrigue. "So you're suggesting that I, someone who's traveled the world and tasted the best of the best, might be the problem here?" The waitress didn't flinch. "Not at all," she replied smoothly. "But taste, is as much about perspective as it is about skill. Sometimes, even the most experienced palate can be challenged by something unfamiliar. It doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it's different. The room was utterly silent now, every diner captivated by the exchange. Andrew Tate, the man who was rarely outmaneuvered in conversation, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. It wasn't that he had been bested. It was that her response was so unexpected, so disarmingly poised, that it took him a moment to process. After what felt like an eternity, he leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from mild irritation to something resembling amusement. "You've got a way with words," he admitted, nodding slightly. "I'll give you that." The waitress inclined her head gracefully. "Thank you, sir. I'll be sure to pass your feedback on to the kitchen. In the meantime, if there's anything else I can assist you with, please don't hesitate to let me know." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Tate and the entire dining room staring after her in stunned silence. The tension had not dissipated, but transformed into something else entirely: admiration, curiosity, and an unspoken respect for a waitress who had dared to meet Andrew Tate's critique head-on. As the waitress exited the scene, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted from tense anticipation to a kind of electric awe. Whispers rippled through the crowd, diners leaning toward one another to exchange hurried opinions on what they had just witnessed. "Did you hear that?" One man at a nearby table murmured to his companion. "She practically called him out right there in the middle of the room." "She didn't flinch either," another guest added, barely concealing their admiration. "I've seen people fold under less pressure from him." Meanwhile, Andrew Tate sat quietly, his usually commanding demeanor replaced by an expression of thoughtful stillness. He tapped his fingers lightly against the edge of the table, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't often that someone caught him off guard, and certainly not in such a public setting. But there was something about the waitress's calm, collected response that had left an impression on him. It wasn't just the content of her words, it was the delivery, sharp, articulate, and undeniably confident. The diners around him continued to steal glances in his direction, some openly staring, as if waiting for his next move. Would he demand to see the manager? Call for another dish? Leave in a storm of dissatisfaction? But to everyone's surprise, Tate did none of these things. Instead, he reached for his glass of wine, took a measured sip, and leaned back in his chair, seemingly unbothered. The buzz in the room only grew louder. Couples whispered theories about how the exchange might end up on social media, while others speculated about the waitress herself. "She must have known who he was," one guest said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Who else would have the guts to stand up to him like that?" "She's either incredibly brave or completely unaware," another quipped, eliciting a round of quiet laughter from their table. But amidst the chatter, there was also an undercurrent of respect. The waitress had done something many would never dare to. She had challenged Andrew Tate, a man renowned for his verbal sparring and unflinching confidence, and she had done so with grace and composure. It wasn't just her words that had resonated, it was the way she had carried herself, as if she too was accustomed to commanding attention and respect. When she reappeared moments later to check on another table, the room's energy shifted once again. Heads turned, eyes following her every move. She was no longer just a waitress. She was the star of the evening, her every gesture imbued with a newfound significance. Even Tate seemed to track her movements, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if studying her from a distance. Finally, when their gazes briefly met, the waitress offered him a polite, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, but nothing more. It was a masterful move, maintaining her professionalism while subtly asserting her presence. Tate responded with a faint smirk, raising his glass in a gesture that could have been interpreted as either respect or amusement, or perhaps both. As the evening wore on, the buzz around the exchange refused to die down. By the time dessert was served, it had become the centerpiece of conversation at nearly every table. Some speculated about whether Tate would leave a scathing review, or perhaps turn the encounter into one of his infamous online monologues. Others debated whether the waitress had truly won the interaction, or if Tate had allowed her to have the last word as a kind of backhanded compliment. But whatever the outcome, one thing was clear. The moment had left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. Even the staff seemed energized by the incident, exchanging sly smiles and knowing glances as they moved through the dining room. When the check finally arrived, Tate took his time inspecting it before pulling out his card. He paused for a moment, then added something to the receipt, a handwritten note perhaps, or an additional gratuity. No one could see exactly what he wrote, but when the waitress returned to collect the payment, she glanced at the slip of paper and raised an eyebrow ever so slightly. It was the only visible reaction she gave before tucking it away and thanking him for his patronage. As Tate rose from his seat, the room seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on him as he adjusted his jacket and prepared to leave. But before he exited, he turned briefly toward the dining room, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before landing just for a moment on the waitress. His expression remained inscrutable, but there was a glimmer of something: approval, respect, or perhaps simply amusement. The door closed behind him and the room finally exhaled. Guests began murmuring again, dissecting the encounter and speculating about what the future might hold for both Tate and the waitress. Had he been humbled? Had she earned his respect? Or was this merely another chapter in a story neither of them would soon forget? For her part, the waitress returned to her duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She moved through the dining room with the same poise and professionalism as before, her expression giving no hint of the drama that had just unfolded. But there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet confidence that suggested she understood the significance of what had occurred. She had faced one of the most formidable personalities in the room and emerged unscathed. More than that, she had left an impression. As the evening wound down, the buzz in the restaurant began to fade, replaced by the soft hum of a typical night. But for those who had been there, the memory of the exchange lingered. It was a moment they would recount to friends, a story they would revisit again and again. And as for Andrew Tate, whether he would speak of the incident publicly or keep it as a private anecdote remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the waitress had not just served him a meal, she had served him a lesson, one that neither he nor anyone else in that restaurant would soon forget.